Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Sammy Darrow with Biopharma Connections, and we've been helping Boyds to promote and run today's webinar. In a minute, we'll have Dr. Karen Mullen, Boyds Chief Medical Officer, and Dr. Harriet Gray Stephens, Boyds Medical Director, presenting. Their presentation will last about 30 to 40 minutes, and we will have time for a Q&A session afterwards. Please feel free to leave your questions using the Q&A or the chat functions that are found at the bottom of your screen. Lastly, we will be recording today's session, and that will be available to everyone afterwards as well. And with that, I'll hand it over to Karen and Harriet for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Sammy. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Karen Mullen. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Boyds. Boyds is a global drug development consultancy. We work with small and large biotechs, helping them with their regulatory strategy, their clinical development plan, and executing clinical trials. I head up the medical team, which has MDs, clinical operations, and medical writers. My background is I'm an MD. I trained in London. I've spent 24 years working in the pharma and biotech industry, from early clinical development through to commercialization and medical affairs in Australia, Europe, and the US, across multiple therapy areas. And I've spent the last 2 years working at Boyds and biotechs as Chief Medical Officer for a US and European biotech, both in rare disease and oncology. So look forward to a discussion today. Harriet.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, my name is Harriet, Dr. Gray Stephens. I'm an Oxford-trained medic with a GMC license, so that's the licensing authorities within the UK. My background is an intensivist and anaesthetist prior to transitioning into industry over 8 years ago. My background within the industry includes having run a late-phase contract research organisation over multiple sites, specialising in all sorts of therapeutic areas, but doing primarily add-on therapies to improve outcomes compared with standard of care. I've then worked previously at GSK in their early phase unit as an investigator there, looking really at a range of therapy areas, including first-in-human studies, as well as contributing to the overall clinical development programs, both as a medical monitor and within some strategic roles. Most recently, I've been at Boyds for just over a couple of years now, where my responsibilities include helping Karen within her team, providing strategic input to clients of all stages and all sizes, helping them to realise their clinical development goals and work out where they're going, both from a medical, a patient-centric, and also commercial aspects. So we look forward to talking to you today about your clinical development plan and features that we think are really important for you to consider during the evolution of your plan.
So we all know what a traditional clinical development plan looks like, taking an asset from development through to research and into the clinic, traditionally from phase 1 through to phase 3, then to approval. So intertwined with a good regulatory strategy. We're seeing now more first-in-human studies become first-in-patient, and also adaptive trial design. But as you know, it's not a single standard linear process. It's complex, it's evolving, there's multiple stakeholders and complex regulatory requirements with a changing competitive landscape. In this webinar, we're not going to teach you what a clinical development plan is. We're going to highlight some key areas that we think, if they are addressed and carefully considered, can help de-risk your clinical development plan. I'm going to hand over to Harriet to talk about the time, cost, value conundrum.
When putting together a slide, I really wanted to make a three-way equilibrium between time, cost, and value, because these are the three factors which are really important to consider when you're making decisions regarding your clinical development. It's important to understand and balance these three factors to optimize the timeline, your budget, and also therefore the success of your new treatment. I'd like to today highlight 4 areas that I think are really important, which weigh on this equilibrium. The first of which is vendor selection. As we all know, cheapest isn't always best. Apparent cost savings can easily be taken away by lengthy delays, poor recruitment rates, protocols which aren't fit for purpose and need lots of amendments. When you're selecting a vendor, such as a CRO, it's important to consider what their true functionality and capacity of that vendor is. When you're looking at vendors, it's really important to balance between choosing vendors, outsourcing, and keeping activities in-house. I'd recommend outsourcing your non-core activities because this might be really highly specialised individuals who can provide really good efficiencies to your clinical development. However, in my opinion, it's really important to keep in-house really key functions so you can have good control over these really important aspects of your clinical development programme. The second thing I'd like to highlight is setting limits. We need to avoid the sunken cost fallacy. The sunken cost fallacy is where you pour more money or time or other resources into a sinking ship with limited returns. It's important to avoid this by setting clear go, no-go decisions, limits, but also to dynamically review these regularly. Sometimes you just have to take a bird's eye view, admit defeat, such as, for example, I've seen sites which really fail to recruit patients or volunteers and just cut your losses and look for alternatives, such as other sites. This, I'm afraid, isn't a set process of setting limits. It's about continuously changing those limits and readdressing them so that you can update your plan as you go along and know what your next go, no-go decision would be. Within this, I'd say never be afraid to ask for help in setting these limits, whether it be a partner, a colleague, an academic institution. Sometimes they can be really helpful in setting these clear limits to avoid sunken cost fallacy. We recommend using expert consultants who are able to provide key expertise, whether it be clinical development specific or therapy type specific or indication specific, because whilst on the front they can seem really expensive, their expert advice can be really, really helpful in balancing time and cost and therefore value. The last point I'd like to talk about is timing. Early is really only just on time. Everything clinical development takes a lot longer than you'll ever think. By the time you've thought of it, you should probably already be doing it. This includes things such as regulatory strategy. Often we get asked, when should I go for scientific advice? It is never generally too early to go for advice. And by having some thoughtful thoughts and just putting some information together, it can really help even early on to frame your clinical development pathway. Talking to patients very early on can be really helpful and historically has been omitted from clinical development. But having a patient perspective is super useful in framing where you're going with your clinical development. I'll hand back to Karen for our next bit.
So good science is the cornerstone. You must have a sound scientific rationale. This helps you understand how your asset is going to interact and modify the disease process. So it's really important to have this good translational medicine, taking your preclinical and on animal models and data and working out how that is going to work within the clinic. Understanding your mode of action, really important, and that your mode of action is played out in your preclinical data and then through into your clinical data. So you have this common thread of science into the clinic and developing this early on. And I talk about telling a scientific story, and I will talk more about that later. But understanding that science helps you then define your patient population, selecting potential indications or prioritizing those indications, and where your intervention can provide a clinical benefit. So you see from your preclinical data, you understand your mode of action, you then follow through with your target engagement and your on and off target effects. So understanding disease models, and we know that in some diseases, animal models are better than others, and you have to have considerations around cell and gene therapies and around biologics, but then getting together that proof of concept, very important. And remember that in the clinic and in real life, you're not just treating disease, you're treating illness. So understanding how that disease is reflected in terms of symptoms, quality of life, patient-related outcomes, again, following through on that common thread. So the use of experienced non-clinical CROs, if you don't have that translational expertise in-house, that can really help design and conduct the initial non-clinical package to the right regulatory standards and advice around GLP. Safety. Understanding a vigorous preclinical testing prior to going to humans is absolutely key. And ultimately, signals that you get within those preclinical models, then addressing them within the clinic. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you're seeing some bone or some renal signals in animals, you need to be able to know what is happening in the clinic. So that can be discussed with the regulators, because that's what they're going to expect. So if you're getting, have you looked at bone biomarkers? Have you looked at number of unintended fractures? Have you looked at renal function? So it's really following through that story of what you've seen in animal models and in tox studies that you're actually able to then bear out and look at that data within your clinical studies. What are the adverse events of special interest that you want to define early on and ensure that you're continuing that thread? Are there any safety signals that within your development program, phase 2, phase 3, they need to be independently adjudicated? Because that is important that they have been identified early on. Even if your sense is that they're not going to be a problem, they need to be independently verified so that you can that can be part of your package. Do you need a data monitoring committee? Do you need a safety review committee? And ensuring that that thinking has gone in early. Are you doing an interim analysis? And that brings me on really to talk about regulatory interaction, as Harriet has touched on. This is essential. Early interaction is important, but the timing is key, because what questions are you asking the regulators? If you don't have the right data, you may be going and asking that question a little bit too early, because it's how those questions are framed. And if you've got concerns through your development program, ensuring that you are then connecting with the regulators. If there's something about your stability, if there's some PK samples that haven't been stored correctly, you need to have that dialogue with them in a timely manner, because it may not be quite as important as you think. Or actually something that you don't think is important, the regulators think that is important. And look at what is available to you. What is the regulatory strategy that you want to develop for your molecule? Do you have an option for orphan drug designation? Is there breakthrough? Is there fast track? And weaving that in early into your clinical development strategy, and ensure that you're maximizing those touch points for that regulatory support from the regulators. We also say that, you know, if you're going to have a meeting, a type C, type D meeting, you've written a briefing document and you get a written response back from the FDA, actually still go to that face-to-face meeting. It's not face-to-face anymore, it's virtual, but that is a precious hour where you actually get a real understanding and two-way dialogue. And keep up to date with the regulatory guidelines that are changing all the time and that may actually benefit you, and what are the competitors doing out there, or other molecules that may be of a similar indication. I'll hand it back to Harriet.
So that really brings me nicely onto the point of strategic clinical trial design. A strategically designed trial ensures that it meets most or all of the regulatory concerns that each individual regulatory body has. Because it's important to remember that different regulatory regions will have different remits and different wants from the outcomes or the design of a clinical trial. A poorly designed trial may fail to meet region-specific endpoints or requirements, leading to delays or rejection. Whilst a well-designed trial may also be able to add a body of evidence in a multinational, international approach. I've tried to bring out just 5 aspects of clinical trial design, which I'm really interested in. And I'm afraid I could talk for far too long about them, but I'll try and succinctly emphasize why I believe that they're important to consider and potentially integrate into trials within your clinical development plan. Firstly, I'd like to talk about innovative trial designs, such as umbrella designs, basket trials, platform trials. These allow extra flexibility in addressing multiple therapies or diseases under a unified protocol. An adaptive clinical trial is a type of clinical trial that allows for modifications during the trial contact, but they're pre-specified, things such as dosage, sample size, treatment arms, or patient selection. This is all done on interim data, so it doesn't compromise the validity or integrity of the study. This flexibility allows you to respond to evolving data and can make it more efficient and increase the chances of success. Adaptive trials can be more resource efficient as well, which can be helpful in balancing that time, cost, value conundrum, and also may require fewer patients than a traditional clinical trial, which has significant benefits both to the patients and to sponsors. Secondly, I'd like to talk about novel dose escalation approaches, particularly for early phase trials. We do dose escalation exercises to find out what we call the phase 2 recommended dose. Traditionally, particularly within the oncology space, we look at things like a 3+3 design, where we look to see if patients who are exposed at a single dose level experience toxicity. If they don't, we move up to the next level. But if they do, we'd expand for another 3 patients. The aim of this is to find out what the maximum tolerated dose. Increasingly from the FDA, there's guidance, including Project Optimus, which suggests that this isn't the best way of going and finding the best dose for patients, the phase 2 recommended dose, concentrating perhaps too much on toxicity rather than efficacy. There are alternatives to this traditional approach, which I would call novel escalation approaches, and suggest you go away and read about them. One of which is continual reassessment method. This is a Bayesian approach, which basically uses the data as it comes into the trial to integrate into a platform to continuously reassess. I particularly like the Bayesian optimal interval dosing as a relatively straightforward Bayesian approach. This is a simplified Bayesian method, which requires fewer assumptions than the CRM methods, but also gives you a flexible approach to dose escalation. It uses
Hi everyone, it looks like Harriet may be having a bit of technical difficulties on her end. So we will give her a minute to figure that out. In the meantime, Karen, do you have anything to add to this slide while Harriet is frozen?
Yeah, I think that Harriet is an expert in a Bayesian approach and adaptive trials. But if I could add on to clinical trials, what you want to do is you want to reduce any critical amendments that you're going to have throughout your development program. Ideally, I know that's not always the case, that it's feasible to do that, but that's in the good planning. And actually probably where you need to take the time is to get the right design in the first place. And also not all data is equal. Quite often we see sponsors cutting and pasting previous clinical trials and then adding on additional endpoints. We would say scrap that and actually focus on the endpoints that you want. More data is more cost. Focus on the endpoints you need clinically, the endpoints that you need from a regulatory perspective, and actually having that simplified protocol is your playbook, rather than just adding on to previous trials that have been done in that area. And ensure that it's patient-centric, ensure that you understand the burden on the patient, and that ideally you've had some patient group input into the design of the study as well, because ultimately you want them to stay in the study. You don't want them to withdraw because of the burden of assessments or number of visits within that study. Does it look like we're going to get Harriet back? Oh, she's going to try to dial back in. So I will keep going. Fortunately, Harriet does have the slides. I'm now going to move on to biomarkers. We all know that biomarkers are measurable indicators of a biological process. Their presence is great if there is a biomarker, but it has to be present and it has to change with the change in disease, the severity of the disease, and then be affected by the treatment. So does it measure a response to the therapeutic intervention? And there is regulatory guidelines on this that is very clear. We could have a whole separate webinar on biomarkers. But we know that looking at these surrogates rather than longer term outcomes can be very important to the development process. And I'm sure that we've all got examples of game changers of biomarkers. We all know the examples of survival or cardiovascular endpoints. But I would just say a caution around biomarkers. And it's good to have Harriet back.
Hello, sorry.
You've got to make sure that you can ID them properly. Can you measure them properly? Have you got a validated assay? Is the biomarker validated? Is it reliable? Is it producible? Is it clinically meaningful? And this is all set out in regulatory guidelines. And then ideally you follow that through your development program. So you don't just have it in a phase 3 study at the end. That's been followed through your development program, and discussing that biomarker and your biomarker strategy with the regulators is obviously very important. So they are useful, specifically around identifying a population within your study. If there's any specific mutations in oncology studies, you can then direct the treatment to that population, personalized medicine, used to identify responses early, very helpful in rare disease. But I would say think broadly about biomarkers or surrogate endpoints as well. Can you do liquid biopsies? Can you look at circulating tumor DNA? Are there any clinical surrogates? If you've got a neurologically progressive disease, are there any markers that are have an early response than others, say speech or swallowing, rather than looking for changes in gait or ataxia, which then could become a clinical surrogate? So don't just think about a biochemical biomarker. And then also medical devices come at play here around apps and logarithms, and you have to be very cautious around ensure you've got the right regulatory approval and standards on them. I'm going to hand back to Harriet, see if you want to comment on medical devices, and if there's any more you want to say about clinical trial design. We lost you when you were talking about Bayesian.
Thank you. Sorry about that, Karen, and thank you for continuing. Yeah, to answer, speak a little bit further about biomarkers. So you're probably aware as well of the FDA's guidance around software, and particularly software as a medical device. It's really important to, in my opinion, to ensure that if you're using any devices to either capture your endpoint data or your biomarkers, or to compute it, including things like image recognition technologies, to think about that as also an asset as a as a medical device and to make sure you meet the relevant regulatory requirements. And the problem is they're different internationally as well. So seeking specialist advice and making sure that is part of your validation is really important. If it's okay, Karen, what do you think? Should we keep going through the list? Because I know we're kind of short of time and want to give adequate time for questions. I can always come back to some more points and considerations. And I'm also always really happy to talk about cool and funky things about clinical trials and the strategic design.
I did say you were an expert in Bayesian and adaptive design.
I wouldn't go that far. So statisticians are experts, but there's some interesting things. I think I might just summarise just to talk about that for 2 seconds. Speak to regulators early on about your strategic design. I've had plenty of pushback from different regulators over the years, but there's so much you can do to help patients, whether it be having less people at subtherapeutic dose levels, less toxicity, and it's just worth speaking to the regulators about it and seeing if you can get that integrated into your clinical trial design. I think move on to our next really key important point is thinking about the end game really early on. By that I mean what you're going to put on your product label, whether that be indication, patient populations, dosing or other precautions. It's really important to think kind of backwards about what you want, what the end game is, because you need to make the evidence to justify what those claims are going to be. By thinking about that early, you can put that into your clinical development plan to be able to facilitate that within the development. The problem gets even worse that different agencies have different requirements for labelling. And you need to consider where you want to go in the market, in the world, ideally for worldwide launch, and thus how you're going to meet the data internationally and the requirements for your label within the different regions. It's also important from a kind of commercial perspective as well, because at the end of the day, you want to sell your product, right, to the most patients and have the most patient benefit. So therefore, you need to differentiate your product from what's available currently or you think might be on the market when it comes to launching your product, so you can position it carefully and have a competitive advantage and have information to support that claim. So that would be one of our really key things to consider, particularly if you're looking at things like accelerated approval or conditional pathways, where your development gets even further squished and pressurized. And you might have extra requirements for post-marketing studies. You need to think about this early on with relation to your label.
So now I want to touch on early engagement with key stakeholders. And again, I like to think broadly about stakeholders because you have internal stakeholders too. There may be investors, there may be the board. It's important to communicate with them around the risks of your clinical development, what you're doing to mitigate them, and the key milestones are when you need critical decisions being made. The worst part is getting to a critical point and the board are not on board with the path forward or the decisions that you feel that you should make based on your data. External stakeholders, I'm sure that you all know how important it is to engage with external experts early. Investigators, it's important for the external experts, KOLs, to be involved in your study, but equally it's important to have sites that can recruit, and they can recruit quickly and they can recruit well, because that will reduce your timelines also. Quite often sites outside the US are cheaper, so you also it's the real balance between your speed of recruitment but also engaging with the right investigators and the right sites. External experts are going to give you really sound advice into your clinical development plan and your protocol, into the endpoints, the clinical relevance, are the patients available, I just very important to engage them through, whether it's through advisory boards or scientific advisory boards, or just on one-to-one consultation. Patient groups, obviously very important around patient-centric design of clinical studies. the burden. They will give very frank feedback usually, and becoming increasingly important, and especially in some countries, about when you go to ethics committees that you've actually engaged, you can demonstrate that you've engaged with patients and patient groups. A 6-minute walk test might not be relevant to a patient, but actually activities of daily living are really relevant to a patient. And it's also about getting that balance between patient-centric outcomes and what the regulators require for that intervention. Payers, what do they see as cost effectiveness? Are you going to need to look at real-world data or real-world evidence? Use of resources, reduction in hospital stays, actually starting to factor that into your thinking in your clinical development plan. And as we've said, and we always keep saying, regulators, pre-IND meetings, very important around endpoints, regulatory standards, what is going to be required for your regulatory package, and getting that timing just right when you've got the right questions that you can lay out in front of them. And having a strategy for communicating results through conferences and through all of those stakeholders. It's never too early to start a communication plan. Commercialization is a continuum, regardless of what is going to happen to your asset, whether it's going to be outsourced or sold. Having all these things in play will actually help that medicine get to patients earlier, but also on the financials around that. And as Harriet has said, keep that end goal in mind. Keep what you want to be in that label, patient population, the phase of the stage of the disease. Have that in mind when you're developing your clinical development plan, because regulatory approval is not it's the start. It's not the finish line. From your engagement with your stakeholders, you're going to understand what more information do clinicians need to be able to prescribe, what is needed for reimbursement, what guidelines are important, and also understanding competition and how that is developing in the dynamic market as you're going through your development program. Insights into patient journeys. I could talk a lot about this, but it's fundamentally key to the partnership that you need to develop through clinical development.
I think that brings us on really nicely to our last points, the route to market. As Karen said, once you've got your license, it's not a time to hang your hat up, rest and relax. The first 6 months post-launch of a new medicine are the most important. They are a key predictor and key marker of revenues and thus success. It's important both to prospectively plan for these 6 months and also to monitor for these first 6 months. The first 6 months reflect how the patients are enjoying the medicine, how much, and particularly how much prescribers, primarily physicians and other prescribers, are adopting and changing their policies and the practices of how they prescribe. Early sales figures are a really key indicator of whether a product's value proposition resonates with this target audience. A really strong launch performance suggests that the product positioning is good, messaging is appropriate, and the market access strategies are working. Whereas a weak uptake could signal the need for some adjustments in strategy, the need to incentivize or change how you're capturing your market share. Post-launch, these 6 months provide a really valuable time for insights and what we call real-world evidence, both for safety and efficacy and patient outcomes. This data can either really enforce the findings of clinical trials, and sometimes it can identify new safety concerns or differences in usage patterns. Early feedback from physicians and patients regarding their experiences, both good and bad, adverse events and efficacy, can really help to shape a drug's market position. Positive feedback can really help to accelerate adoption, whilst negative findings can often prompt changes and may lead to the need for increased surveillance or ongoing clinical or post-authorization development work including phase 4 studies, which may be mandated either before the licensing or after licensing for regulatory agencies to get extra information to closely monitor the performance of the new medication. Some post-authorization studies might not just be safety studies, but also be efficacy studies, particularly if there are concerns regarding how well the drug is working in particular populations. The launch of a new medicine is also a really great opportunity to stress test the supply chain. The supply chain at this stage will be completely new, and it's interesting to see if it's functioning efficiently and if the product is easily accessible within all target markets. And it's difficult as well at this stage to really understand or predict what the uptake rates will be. The problem is that supply chain distributions can really put people off prescribing or using that medication. No one wants to be started on a new medication, then the next week told they can't have it because there's been a supply chain problem. That's why it's really important to think about this early on during your planning to leading up to your first 6 months, so that you can maintain supplies internationally for your newly launched products. I like to see it as kind of a feedback loop for this critical period of post-launch, for really a good opportunity to be dynamic, just the same as you would be during a clinical development program, to identify issues, work out what those issues are, whether it be low market adoption, side effects, competitive pressure, and how to think about addressing them and changing them so that you can really establish a good market share sooner rather than later.
So just to touch on the scientific story, it's really important. I feel that you tell that scientific story, built on your key scientific messages, which is that common thread that I referred to earlier, that it's scientifically plausible. It's confirmed through data, both preclinical and early clinical data, that you have target engagement. You then have clinically relevant and acceptable endpoints and tolerability that are relevant to patients also. That scientific story of medicines development is key to success that Harriet is talking about. So in summary, clinical development is challenging. It's incredibly fulfilling, developing innovation. We thank you very much for listening. We've shared some of our top tips and highlighted some key areas around innovative design, which I'm sure Harriet will answer more questions on, regulatory strategy, being patient-centric, and balancing that cost, time and value considerations with an eye on the end game. I hope you found that interesting and helpful, and I look forward to answering any questions or connecting with you after the webinar to be able to talk through some specifics.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen and Harriet, for your presentation. We do have time for questions now, everyone. So if you'd like to leave your questions using the Q&A function or the chat functions, they're both at the bottom of your screens, and we'd love to answer anything you have. And let's see, we'll start off with this one, Karen and Harriet. What would you consider to be your top tips for expediting clinical development?
Do you want me to go first, Harriet?
That would be grand.
Be flexible and be agile. Expect the unexpected, and then you're not blindsided. And what do I mean by that? Well, some of the most successful drugs have come out of unintended consequences. So side effects that were not expected have actually then been the next target engagement for that drug development. So you've got to think broadly, because you always have the eye on your target, but actually think broadly, because patients don't always behave in clinical trials. So you have to be ready for that unexpected. I think don't forget a couple of things which we haven't even touched on in this webinar, because we are so clinically focused that we quite often forget about some of the key things that you need to consider, like CMC and manufacturing. really need to be building that in, and you know, have an expert on hand, if not. And you know, we keep talking about regulatory interactions, but you know, that is essential and can really help you along the way, especially having that regulatory strategy baked into, you know, are you going to go through breakthrough, are you going to go for fast track, are there regulatory things in play that can actually help you with your drug development, because that's what they're there for. You know, more interactions, and keeping on top of those guidelines and regulations that are changing.
Okay, Karen, that's a really good answer. I've had any other top tips? I guess my only other thought, which I think you've really touched on already, I find it so easy to get stuck up in the weeds, you know, stuck down in the minutiae, the details, and particularly, you know, when you're living and breathing your assets development every single day. I think it's really important to sometimes come up for breath, you know, take an overall strategic view, which is really helpful. Why it's helpful to look at the clinical development plan and kind of to refer to that as you go along, because as you say, Karen, it can help to really just make sure you're hitting all the key points as you go along and not missing anything.
Great, thank you both. We have another one. How do you determine which locations to run your clinical trials?
That's a lovely question.
That is a really...
I think there's a couple of considerations here. I mean, firstly, is commercial. Is there a commercial strategy of the company? Is there financial constraints that you can't go broadly? And then I think that another key factor is, what disease are you looking at, and where is it? Where is the prevalence of it? If you're looking at an ultra rare disease, and there may be certain geographical areas, you might have to go to 33 countries to be able to recruit your patients. And actually, what is the standard of care? Because if you're at phase 3 and you're trying to standardize your protocol, then actually it may be that is going to restrict where you can have your study, because they don't have you know, either the comparator that you're looking at or the standard of care that you need to then add on to. So I think those are kind of key focuses. Then there may be regulatory timelines. You know, of some, I mean, you know, in Europe, we're very much talking about harmonization now, but then you have the MHRA, so there may be some key regulatory factors in there. Harriet, have you got anything to add to that?
No, I think the regulatory piece for me is really important. I mean, a number of times I've got pushback on one strategy in one region and then had acceptance in another. I think having a good regulatory advice as well, and reading the guidelines, what's acceptable in different regions, can also help. And I wouldn't say no to a region either early on. Go and get scientific advice there and see what the feedback is and what you're proposing, and take that on board to determine where you're going to go for future regulatory interactions and where you can open your sites. And then also, I guess, to me, related to that as well, is about the cost problem. So for me, it's more of a problem, particularly in later phase trials, when you choose where you're going to go. Early phase, often, you know, particularly for healthy volunteer studies, as long as you've got good quality, you know, GCP, good clinical practice, like compliant data, you can go almost anywhere. But it gets more problematic as you go further down the development route, and that question gets harder to answer.
Great, thank you. Let's see. I love the proof of concept animal study, but it does not always translate into human. Would you comment on the animal scale-up approach from rodent to primates?
Yeah, I'm very happy to discuss. I mean, to say we're not preclinical scientists, but you know, human equivalent dosing is a very arbitrary dose calculation and conversion factor. It was really historically developed for small molecular entities, and with other advanced assets, particularly cell gene therapies and biologics, and particularly immunotherapies, there is no way of using these human equivalent doses to, as Uma says, to scale up. I think it's important when you're looking at translational models between the non-clinical and clinical space to, as Karen has said, understand the science There will be some assets which really do translate nicely, and we can use conservative measures to do human equivalent dosing and dose comparisons. And some, for example, for reasons such as, there isn't the same target, you're having to use transgenic models, or the cascade is very different from a genetic basis in the animals you're interested in, where it wouldn't be suitable. And in these situations, you can look at alternatives to try and work out the human equivalent dosages for this correlation, including the use of primates, so non-human primates. But there are also other ways to look at generating your proof of concept and your dose selection strategies, which have all got good regulatory approval. I think Karen and I would even be able to say that we've had some studies where we haven't had non-clinical data because there isn't a suitable animal model.
Yeah.
But by speaking to the regulators in different regions, we've been able to navigate successfully that translation into the clinic by giving an adequate package of data that's relevant and specific to the asset of interest. Does that help to answer your question? And if you've got any further questions, let us just pop one into the chat, please.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Next question. Since selecting the right indication and patient population can be difficult, do you have any advice on how to optimize this?
Yes. We've done a few exercises around indication selection, actually, and I think you have to be kind of quite objective when it comes to this. If you're struggling about where you should go first or where you should go next, and it's about having a kind of system of what's important to the sponsor, what's important to the biotech, from a commercial perspective, or from an orphan disease perspective, and then looking at, okay, what's the science, what's the mode of action, so what's going to scientifically make sense, what's the competitive landscape looking like, kind of going forward, because if you're developing something that's IV, but actually the standard of care before you get to market is going to be oral, or at a different line of therapy, then actually you need to kind of pivot to a different indication, and carefully looking at which line of therapy, what combination would that be with. The ease of finding patients and running those clinical trials. You might have a great scientific story, but actually you can't feasibly run those studies, especially a placebo-controlled study. Where are the number of patients? Is it feasible to actually be able to develop that drug, and then from a commercialization perspective, and then putting that into a scoring system. And then if you do that objectively based on what are the key factors for that particular sponsor, then you do start to get a pattern jumping out at you of what are the key, the top 5, or the priority of indications.
That was really well put, Karen.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. How do you go about choosing if and when to go for regulatory interactions and selecting which agencies to approach first?
Go on, Harriet.
This is a really difficult question. So there's lots of different strategies with regards to where you would want to go for your interaction, and where to start first and when. So start when you've got appropriate data. There's different approaches I've seen different companies take. Some like to prioritize where they are geographically from a logistics perspective, and some like to utilize other regulatory incentives or initiatives available within that region. Of those kind of 2 approaches that I primarily see, I really would recommend the latter of the 2. It's really important to work out what is special about your asset. Is it that it might be an orphan, so a rare disease? Is it that it's a cell or a gene therapy and something really super advanced? And there might be particular individuals with special interests and thus knowledge within an agency who would be more understanding, more appreciative. Often we see individuals go to multiple agencies kind of almost in parallel. And sometimes this approach can also be really helpful. For example, within Europe recently, I've been to one regulatory interaction where we've got really quite conservative feedback on what I thought was a really conservative approach. And thus, by going to another agency outside of Europe, they're able to get some other advice or some other viewpoints. And by going for this early advice, you can kind of hedge your bets, if that makes sense, and decide which agency or which area works best for you. I have to say, however, there's a really important caveat to this within the European Union. When you're having regulatory interactions within the EU under the EMA, they will ask for a copy of interactions that you've previously had. It's obviously quite a difficult situation to put an agency in for an individual national scientific advice, because the people within the EMA don't want to be seen to be providing directly opposing opinions. So it's really important to consider this transparency, which is required within the EMA when you are going to look at multiple pieces of regulatory advice within different regions, and to understand that they will share that information, and thus this can influence your strategy regarding areas where you want to get advice.
Great, thank you, Harriet. We have time for one more question. So here it is. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Would the same themes presented here also be key for consideration in regards to large-scale decentralized clinical trial planning?
Yes. I think there's a few things that are meant by decentralized clinical trials, so it would be interesting to know specifically what you are talking about. But I do think that that is the way forward, and I'd like to see a lot more decentralized clinical trials. So I think it really helps patients, it helps recruitment, and if we can get the caveats around that and the standards around that, then I think it would be really important. I mean, to the level of even measuring outcomes in patients' homes, you know, through AI and through technology, you know, and that's something that we've certainly looked at. You know, as we're moving to more chronic dementia type diseases, you know, not just neurologically progressive in children or young adults, but actually the measurements taken in patients' home about their gait, how can they stand, are more relevant than actually seeing these patients that are taking into tertiary referral centres or, you know, large scale hospitals where actually it's so difficult to really see how the impact on them on a day-to-day is. Even respiratory studies where you want to measure overnight breathing, you know, can be done at home by various different devices. So I'd really like to see that that happening more and more. And I think that we should be real champions of that for patients and drug development. Harriet, any comments?
Agreed. I mean, I have to confess, I've got a bit of an insider opinion. So I wrote my MBA kind of consulting project for a large pharma company on decentralized clinical trials. And I completely agree with Karen. They are the future, and they are a really key component of the cost value time conundrum. Because whilst you think that they're more expensive, you know, to set up more decentralized trials, there's a lot of administrative work. The value derived from seeing patients, as Karen said, in their own home, so they don't drop out of the clinical trial because they can't get to the university or tertiary referral centre, is absolutely massive. But you also get real world value data out of it, important patient outcomes from these decentralised trials. And I really believe that, yes, there are some key considerations specific to decentralised trials, with additional problems associated with their conduct. The general idea within late phase clinical development is very similar to the paradigms that we've presented today.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, both of you, for your presentation and your answers to the questions. We really appreciate your time today. And thank you for everyone for joining as well. As a reminder, we will have a recording of this presentation available for you all to share soon, and the slides that Karen and Harriet presented. If you had a question and we didn't get to it, please feel free to email us With the follow-up, I will be including Karen and Harriet's contact information. You're more than welcome to reach out to them as well. And yeah, thank you again for joining, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for
Thank
joining
you.
us.